Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to the newest edition of Books and Looks, brought to you by your good friends at Podcast Studio X. And it's that time when we have our weekly podcast in which we take a look at a book, interview the author, and then have something I'm looking at. And boy, have we got a good book today. The book's called The Glass Chateau, and I really hope all of you go to my website, viewsonbooks.com, and read that review. It's a wonderful review. We try not to give away a lot of the spoilers during our interview, but that's why I'm hoping you go and you read that review, okay? Also, you're going to be able to get this podcast on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and for those of you who prefer it, we have it as an audio only on YouTube. You can get it that way, too. Anyway, Steve Kiernan is here from Vermont. He's joining us today, and he's talking all about this book, which was inspired by the life of the artist Marc Chagall, a wonderful artist who got into stained glass windows in the 1950s. It's a wonderful book that was inspired by him. It's all about healing in post-war France. And we have a main character by the name of Asher, who was an assassin in the resistance, and he is in need of help. He's in need of definitely peace. And there's a lot of very interesting questions and philosophical questions that we talk about in here, having to deal with war and peace, as well as the healing process that so many people have. And Stephen's going to tell us all about his experiences also in learning how to try to blow glass himself and make some stained glass, and all the difficulty, and what the town of Clovide, which is his town in this book, what it's based upon, and the cathedral they're working on, what's that based upon. And we follow these people, we follow all this group of people who have been, again, hurt by World War II, and they get together, but they all have a talent in one way or the other to make stained glass. And it's a really interesting and inspiring, very good book. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Again, it's one that is not your traditional book on World War II. So without any further ado, let's just go right in and have our chat with Steve Kiernan. Stephen, welcome to Books and Looks.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Stephen is joining us today from up in scenic Vermont. As a matter of fact, we're recording this on National Vermont Day, which Steve says every day is National Vermont Day for him.
You know, it's beautiful out here, and I look out at probably 1,400 acres of farmland from my basement office, and the sun is shining, and, it hasn't snowed yet, so I'm very happy.
That's great. Anyway, before we get into your books, you have got, my friend, a wonderful background. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where did you go to college? Would you take creative writing courses? How did you get into this whole writing profession?
I guess the place I start with that story, Blaine, is I grew up in a rural, small town in upstate New York, and I'm one of 7 kids, and I'm on the young end. And so we all would have dinner together every night. So there's 9 of us around the table, and it's all strong personalities. And I don't really remember this so much, but my brother Mike tells us, about me, like starting a story and just doing everything I could to keep everyone at the table's attention for as long as I could as the young kid, And then, of course, they always moved on. I was a boring little kid. But I remember telling stories to my grandmother, my mother's mother, who I loved. And, I think I've always been a storyteller. So the problem is, of course, my folks were very conservative people, and they really, between the Depression and World War II and so on, they really believed that you could not make a living as a writer. And they were very concerned about that and really opposed me being a writer. And I remember one time my mother just cut out, with no comment, she just put it on my pillow. When I came home from college one semester, on my pillow was a headline from the New York Times and said, average U.S. author makes $6,000 a year. And I thought, well, that's the kind of encouragement the son likes. But what I did was, for the next 10 years, that was taped on the wall above my typewriter as a motivator, and there's a way that it really tested my commitment to it. When I got out of college, I spent some time working in business and was not great at it and was getting up early in the morning to write. And I wrote a terrible, terrible novel during that time, but I was trying it. And I realized I needed to get more schooling in it. I'd gone to Middlebury College and had a good English literature education and some writing classes that were helpful. But you could only go so far on your own. At least that was my feeling. I got into the Iowa Writers Workshop and spent a couple years out there. And it was terrific. and competitive, but really supportive too. And while I was there for the cash that I needed, I started writing for the local newspaper. And that ended up turning into about 20 years of working in newspapers, which was at that time very, very compelling work. You know, the industry of local news is in really rough shape for a lot of reasons I can carry on about. But fundamentally, it meant that I was immersed for all those years in the stories of the communities that I was in, and I was working with language all the time. And I started to write about healthcare in particular, and that was the beat that I had. And they were talking about changing some laws for end-of-life care, and even physician-assisted suicide was proposed here in Vermont. And as I started to write about this, people started coming up to me and telling me stories from their lives about how their grandmother's life had ended or how their father died. And sometimes they were lovely stories, but most of the time they were pretty hideous. And it was about way too much medical intervention and no one acknowledging when the end was near and all that sort of thing. So I wrote a nonfiction book called Last Rites about how we can take better care of people in the last chapter of their lives. And then I was in the book world. And after a couple of nonfiction books, I said, look, I've always wanted to be writing novels. I've written a bunch on the side that weren't very good. I'm going to take the leap. And now, you know, I've just delivered my 6th novel manuscript to my editor in New York, and I feel very, very fortunate. I do not have a big talent. I have a very small one, but I have a big work ethic. So I revise and revise and revise. It's a trick about writing is you can make yourself look better than you are and smarter than you are because you go over something 20 times. You're trying to improve it. And so that's been it. And I've been very, very fortunate and I hope that, you know, so I've had 8 books out now and 6 of them novels. And, you know, I'd like to get another 18. I want my last act to be typing the end,
the end
of the book, and then I'm done. I really love the work. I really do.
I was just reading something about Lucy Maud Montgomery, who wrote the Anne of Green Gables series. And she wrote 18 books and delivered her last book to the publisher on the day she died. And took 60-some years till it was published, but it finally got published.
It's a great story. Last night I was in a Zoom call for the poet Bob Pack, and he died in June, but his book came out this week, his last book, and I think it's his 25th or something like that.
Oh, wow.
It was great because it was all these poets and writers and people that have been students of his or colleagues of his for the last 70 years. It was pretty terrific, actually.
Yeah. Wow. You don't downplay your journalism, but you're an award winner. Not just a journalist. You won the George Polk Award, if I'm not mistaken. What is the George Polk Award, and what was that all about?
It wasn't a target that I had my sights set on or anything, but what happened is that I kept hearing stories about physicians in this state who were making big mistakes and not being penalized in any way. And I found a physician who wrote herself prescriptions for thousands and thousands of opioid pills, and a surgeon who had multiple wrong site surgeries. So, you know, he's supposed to fix the right knee and he fixed the left knee, stuff like that. And nothing happened to these people. And it turned out that there was a regulatory system for physicians and it was really broken. And the stories of people and what had happened to them were very compelling. So I wrote about that. I was told, you know, I didn't even know that my editor had entered me in this. And so he said, hey, you won the George Polk Award. And I said, great. And the guy who called me up from the award was incredibly flattering. And it's like, okay, so there's this lunch in New York where I go to get the award. And I get there, and the two of the other people getting it that day are Gloria Steinem and the man who was on 60 Minutes Forever and Ever. And I'm forgetting his name now. It was like people at that level, you know, and I'm like, at that point, I was working at the Burlington Free Press in Vermont. And so I did not have the kind of credentials of those folks or the size audience, but I did have, again, sort of that work ethic. It was old shoe leather kind of reporting. So it's pretty fun to be in that setting. And, you know, you don't, at least I don't do any writing for the awards. It's that I love the writing and I love the readers. Those are really the things that motivate me. And yeah, my journalism did really well. I got 40 awards over the course of the years that I did that. It was never the goal. It was really like to enjoy what I got to learn and writing it, and then really being like as good to readers as I could be, which is about accuracy and craft when there's time and telling the best story and trying to find the best story, all those sorts of things.
I was going to say, that's a lot of chicken dinners to get your awards.
Yeah, it's a lot of State Board of Education meetings, I'll tell you that. In my share.
Oh, my. Well, let's get on to the Glass Chateau. You know, What was your inspiration for writing this book and the time period? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Where I started was you try to think about what kind of a story are people going to want to read in 2 years or 3. And if in my mind, in the later part of 2020, when we were really in the COVID mess still, and there was a lot of political discord in the country, and we had the Me Too movement was really getting traction. Black Lives Matter had become an important part of the discourse in the country. And there was all of this passion that was being expressed and a lot of division. And I thought, that only lasts so long. And then something else occurs. And so I thought, what kind of a story are people going to want? They're going to want a healing story. They are. And I've been writing these war stories, these World War II stories. I started looking for healing stories. And, I looked to Reconstruction in the United States after the Civil War. And in my layman's understanding of it, we didn't do a great job. So that was not the place to do it. And so, there's still unhealed wounds from that all these years later. And I'm not a politician or policy guy. I don't know what the answer is, but I knew that that wasn't the story that I felt people needed. And so I started shopping around, and I remembered that when I was doing the research for The Baker's Secret back in 2015, and I was looking at pictures of the time, I saw all these destroyed cathedrals. When I was in France to do the research for the book, all the cathedrals were rebuilt and beautiful and gorgeous and amazing and sacred feeling places. And so I thought, the rebuilding of the cathedrals after World War II, that might be a very interesting rebuilding story. And so that started my research. And then I found that there were individual artists who had built their reputations on the windows that they built, the stained glass windows for bombed out cathedrals. And that among those people was Marc Chagall, this great, great, great artist. And here's what I say about Marc Chagall. I'm not an art historian. I've never taken a class in art history, anything like that. But I remember when I was working construction in my 20s, early 20s, and I was on the demolition team of a construction company. And one day we're working, and this woman walked by who was a friend of mine, and she stopped. And we were all like, sweaty, muddy guys on our lunch break. And she said, "Do you want to have a beer after work?" And I said, "Yeah." And when she left, for the rest of the day, all the guys on the crew called me Romeo. I don't think they all knew Shakespeare, but somehow Romeo and Juliet was in their mind, right? They called me Romeo. And the same is true with Marc Chagall. Even if you don't know anything about this guy, I'll just tell you that when he was about the same age I was when I was working construction, to make a living, he was painting backdrops for an opera company in Moscow. And there was one opera they were doing about great music, and he painted a guy playing a violin who was like 3 times the size of a building. And he's sort of above a town. He's maybe floating in the air, or he's maybe more like dancing on the houses and that sort of thing. And that's where the Fiddler on the Roof came from.
Ah, okay.
But we know Marc Chagall, even if we've never seen any of it. And his stained glass windows completely cool and transformed it. And I said, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to do a story about rebuilding the cathedrals, but in particular stained glass windows. And so I took men from every kind of politics and background, all of them damaged by the war. And somehow they got to work together to build these windows. And that's how it happened.
And so while Marc Chagall's an inspiration, he's not really a character in this book.
He's not, but his work is. He did these weird paintings where like cows fly and fish can go through the air and hand somebody a bouquet of flowers. And I definitely have those sorts of things. I do have flying cows. And, I have this scene that's narrated, part of a scene that's narrated from a bird that's flying over the conversation. And I don't think it's very weird. It's just a little bit imaginative. And I had great fun with that, looking at this guy's paintings and saying, well, I wonder if there's a place this would fit in the story. He's much more fanciful and kind of weird than me. And I'm pretty straight line thinking like a journalist. So it's good to have his imagination to kind of open my horizons.
Did he help in the rebuilding or doing any of the stained glass for the cathedrals over in Europe?
One cathedral in particular, yes, he's got glass around Europe. And, he also has glass in Jerusalem. And he has a whole project for peace that he did for Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, where the United Nations is in New York. And I didn't get to Jerusalem, but I did see a lot of his other windows, and they're fantastic. So the first windows that he had in a cathedral were in Reims, which is a city in eastern France, I'm going to say 40, 50 miles from the German border. And the cathedral in my novel is modeled after that cathedral. And the windows that the men are working on to put in are the windows that Chagall did install there.
You begin this book with these three resistance fighters. And it's a wonderful way to get started. The war has basically ended, it's right at the very end, and you have these three resistance fighters together. All, I guess, became friends as part of the resistance. Are they all Jewish? I know Asher was Jewish. Are the other two Jewish also?
I think that they are, but I'm not sure. They're there very briefly, and it's a beginning that I worried about because you introduce these characters and the reader attaches right away. And two of them are gone inside of a chapter, and it's to make the point that Asher is really alone.
But you use them so beautifully. I mean, you get that first chapter. Friends, if you read the first chapter, you can ponder for days these questions. For instance, one of the very first questions that's posed by these three gentlemen together is victory the same as peace?
There it is.
Tell us a little bit about that, and how does that even tie in with the rest of the book then?
I think that the evidence that I saw as I was doing homework on that period of history, I didn't have that sentence when I wrote the first draft. I just started the story and that scene. But as I was doing more research and learning about what it was like in France after the war, if people are a historian, they know that the Marshall Plan, which the United States created, Secretary of State Marshall came up with this idea to give billions of dollars to the nations of Europe to rebuild because the people were starving and because they were worried that they would turn to communism as a way of solving their problems. And so we gave billions of dollars away and really contributed to the reconstruction of Europe. But the money didn't get there until 1949. So we had basically 4 years where the people of these countries were starving. Like, congratulations, you won, and now your cathedral's destroyed, and your homes are destroyed. 1.5 million structures were destroyed. Bridges, schools, hospitals, churches, homes. I mean, you name it. It was all flattened. 1.5 million structures. And so, a spectacular amount of work to be done. And we think of like victory, and now let's have a parade and it's over. And that's just not the reality that I found doing the research. So that also happens to be true for the men, that now there's victory, but they're a long way from peace. They are full of grief over what they've lost, and they are carrying some guilt for the things they had to do to win the war.
Right. You wrote another selection in that first beginning of the book where you write, and you touched on it a minute ago, every bridge in the nation, every major road, rail line, gas line, and power line, every church, school, factory, or hospital lies flattened in a nation so thoroughly shattered. Peace is a cruel fantasy. That's a wonderful, wonderful sentence.
Thank you. Of course, the written version is better than me just sounding off. I should just pull that sentence out,
Well, do you think today's generation understands how devastating that war was in terms of obliteration of everything that was in that country?
It's funny how your perspective changes. I was born in 1960, and I thought of World War II as ancient history. Might as well have been the Revolutionary War. It was so long before my time. And now I realize I was born 15 years after it ended. It's not long at all. And it was still very much in the culture. It was certainly in my father, who had bad dreams and had injuries from his service in the Pacific Theater. It informed my parents' opinions about Vietnam as well. And so I don't know how much it's a presence for a young generation now, because war has become, how do I want to say it? It's become abstract. I had more emotional attachment to what was going on in Vietnam, with my older brothers being eligible for the draft, than I did with our longest war ever in Afghanistan. I never really had an understanding of what territories were at stake and what we were really doing there. And so I feel like until Ukraine and now the Middle East, I felt like war was more of an abstraction. It is certainly not an abstraction now. When we look at what's been done to, the Russian method of warfare in Ukraine is to simply destroy an entire town and everything in it. And what's going, on the terrorism that has now, by Hamas, has created this path of destruction in response that is sure understandable. And I'm not sure how well that will go for the civilians who are innocent. And, I think like suddenly it's real. And a friend of mine who works in a high school was saying, try to convince kids to not use TikTok this week because of how graphic the violence is.
Right.
I think it's becoming vivid for this generation now.
Yeah. Well, then I love this other thing, because this other statement you wrote is just fantastic. when they're talking. Again, these three guys are talking. This is the first chapter, friends. First chapter. He said, the right are the appeasers who signed the armistice. The left are the rabble-rousers and the resistance, and everybody else is a communist. Were other countries like that? Was Belgium and everything else the same way?
You know, I didn't study all the other countries, but I can tell you it was a real concern. And there was a lot of propaganda and so on about whether or not going to the Soviet support was the right path for those countries. And, you know, I think you can look at a lot of the governments of Western Europe now, and they definitely have a more socialist bent. If you look at the, you know, safety net programs and so on, they have a more socialist bent than our country. One of the things that I love about France, and it's inconvenient as can be, is at all times someone is on strike about something. And I think, like, as Americans, sometimes people kind of mock that, but I think it's actually really healthy, because what that is democracy. And people are making some noise and disagreeing and blocking the sidewalks, and I think it's terrific. It's a little less genteel, but if you want something that's more efficient or quieter, you can go get a dictator. It'll be nice and quiet. I'd rather have the safety people at the airports on strike, which happened the last time I was there, where, you know, there was no one to check your bag or put you through a scanner to get on your flight. Those people were on strike. There is still some of the vestiges of that social experiment, a socialist experiment, for good and bad, right? Tax rates are high. So I don't presume to know whether it's a better or worse thing. It was up for grabs, whether France would be a socialist country or a democratic country.
And see, you made us think. Right away, you make us think about that issue. And it's exactly, and I take it, because I'm Italian, I take it one step further, how befuddled and confused Italy was, not just after the war. They're still befuddled and confused. I don't think Italy knows what they're doing.
No, me either. But I still think that the woman who was the mayor of Rome is still my secret sweetheart. She may not know it, but she was so smart and so beautiful. I think of her when I think of Rome. It's like there's the Vatican and there's her.
Yeah, good. Anyway, hey, let's talk a little bit about your lead character. His name is Asher. What's his backstory? And this is really his book, if I'm not mistaken.
It is his story for sure. So Asher was a small businessman. He was a maker of very fine boots. And they weren't like the fanciest, but he had a reputation of making things that really lasted, because he had a way of putting layers on and so on. And he is married to a girl he knew in his childhood and fell in love with in his late teen years. And they have a daughter, Rachel. And it is giving nothing away. It's told to the reader very early on that he saw his wife and daughter killed early on in the war, and in a particularly painful way. And not that there's a painless way, but it's particularly brutal and vivid in his memory. And so he joined the resistance. And he was taking the risk doing that as a Jewish man, but at that point, he really probably couldn't have escaped anyway. And so he went into the woods and became an assassin for the resistance. And it literally became a way that he stayed fed. And it was feeding lots of things, and it was helping him manage this unspeakable rage that he had about what happened. And all of his family otherwise got loaded onto trains and carried away and never to be seen again. And these assassinations are not like sharpshooter 300 yards away or 500 yards away with a rifle. These are very much retail, personal. His hands on the person's throat, him holding the knife in a person's belly kind of thing. And so when the war ends, he is damaged goods. You know, he's full of guilt. He's full of grief. He goes to where his home was, it's destroyed. He goes to where his business was, it's destroyed. As you say, the first chapter, he's with his two friends that have stayed with him through the war. They both decide they're going to go make mischief in different ways and leave him there. And he is contemplating suicide because he has nothing left. Oh, yes, he also went to the synagogue where he worshipped as a boy, and it's been burned to the ground. So he literally has nothing. And he goes down to the water's edge to drown himself because the village he grew up in is on the English Channel. And there's a woman there who convinces him not to do that, but to go to a place where good things are happening. And he wanders and wanders, slowly kind of starving himself to death until he arrives at the chateau, where he gets a meal, and then a job, and then another meal, and then a roof over his head. And then he remembers in his childhood that he used to draw a lot, and he starts designing stained glass windows, and he has a knack for it, maybe even a talent for it. And it turns out that he's actually a spectacular artist. And the emotional depth that he has because of his losses and pain mean that he transforms the art of stained glass windows. And that was also what led me to Marc Chagall, because he totally changed the rules about what a window could be and do and say and contain.
Asher goes to the town of Clovide. That's a fictional town, but where in France would you place that?
So that is the cathedral in Reims is where I'm talking about, and that cathedral is in honor of Saint Clovide, Clovid. It's based on that town and the river on that town and the geography of that town and the cathedral of that town, the ways that it was destroyed and rebuilt and where the windows were put in. That all came from the actual cathedral in Reims.
One of the things I find interesting is that he's ready to drown himself, and a lady and a dog show up, which you talked about, and she convinces him to go to Clovide, and when he turns around, she's gone. And this happens numerous times. When he's lost, somebody comes out of nowhere and tells him where to go or how to get there. There's a little bit of mysticism in this book.
You're asking about one of my secrets. Here's the thing, okay? The significant thing about this old woman, do you remember what makes him notice her so much?
Oh, first of all, she had a dog.
That's it. She had a dog. Because the Germans confiscated all the dogs because they didn't want to worry about them, or, I don't know if they were for food, what it was, but they caught and killed all the dogs. And this woman has a dog, and it's an old dog, which means it lived through the war, okay? And then he turns around and she's gone. When's the next time that we see a dog?
I think it was a little girl, I'm not sure. But there's somebody kicking a ball, and there's a dog there, too.
There are two boys who are playing with the ball and their dog. He's in the town of Clovide, but he can't find the cathedral. And they roll the ball down the hill. And when he chases the ball, so it won't go in the gutter, he sees the cathedral. And he brings the ball back up, and they're gone. When's the next time that we see a dog?
I think he's going to see the lady in
Marie.
the book.
He's going to Marie's house for dinner for the first time. And he gets a little bit lost. And along comes a girl on a bicycle with a dog. And they show him the way to go, and then they're gone. And then when there's one more time that there's a dog. Do you remember when that is?
I don't think I remember that fourth time. I'm sorry.
Fork in the road on the next to last page. And the little girl gives them directions, and that time the dog goes with them. And this isn't a mystical or religious book, so I'm not going to use the word angels. But let's just say that not all angels have 2 feet. Some might have 4. And so when the dog goes with him now, he has moved into a different category because of what he's going to do at the end. This is they rode off into the sunset ending, but I want them to ride off with a particular grace.
I did pretty good. You could tell I read the book. Huh?
Exactly. Spot quiz. Very good.
Well, oh my, oh my, oh my. Oh boy, oh boy. Did this remaking and rebuilding of the cathedral and the use of the stained glass, did that start right after the war, or was there a gap of a few years before this actually started developing?
The glass, it was some years. A little bit of a yarn about that. It was an exertion for me to get to that cathedral. I first applied to it and was accepted to live in an artist's colony about 2 hours, hour and a half train ride south of that town. And which was a fantastic place. And I wrote about a third of the book at that artist colony. Fantastic experience to live in France, rural countryside, all of that. At any rate, it also was like getting myself there. And the cheapest flight from Vermont actually was to fly through Iceland, have like a night in the airport in Iceland. And then I got to Reims and the hotel reservation was screwed up. So I was really away from everything. So the point being, it was a big exertion. When I finally got to the cathedral, the cornerstone says that they started building this place in the year 818. Then it's, I don't know, maybe 200 yards long and 150-foot ceilings. And it's this incredible holy place. And I got there and I wanted to run to the back to see the Chagall windows. I mean, I have like books about those windows. I have pictures of those windows that are over the window in front of my desk right now here in my office. I know those windows, but I'm not going to run. It's like I finally got here. I'm just going to savor it. And so I went clockwise around the cathedral and I went down the left-hand side and there are these plaques. And it turns out at the end of the war, this was the first place where the government officials of France sat down with the government officials of Germany to begin a process they called rapprochement. We're going to reestablish relationships. They've got 180 miles of shared border. There are people going back and forth like, how are we going to relate to one another now? And I got different versions of this story, but I'm going to repeat the one that I like best. I think it's accurate, but at any rate, so they have like a prayer, and then they're going to start negotiations about how are we going to rebuild our countries. And the head of the German delegation says, we would like the people of Germany to speak first. And the French are like, no way, bud. You are not speaking first. And the guy came around in front of the desks. They're on opposite sides of this room in this huge church, and he gets down on his knees and says, we beg the opportunity to speak first. And the French say, no, it's our first concession, and we'll remember. And then he says, this is a cathedral where France crowned its kings, and it had some of the best stained glass windows in the world. And now all of those openings are covered with boards, and we're using lamps and chandeliers to light our work here today because of that. And so we invite the people of France to go find the greatest stained glass window makers on earth to replace these boards with beautiful religious art, and it will be paid for by the people of Germany.
Wow.
And the windows that they put in were by Marc Chagall. And so not only am I sitting there thinking, I've got a novel, but I'm also thinking, today, Germany and France have the same currency. They both belong to the European Union. If Germany and France can mend from their divisions, what's possible for America?
That's exactly correct. Exactly correct. Wow. I like that version of the story a lot. That's good. That's tremendous. One scene which popped in my mind as we were just talking here, you have a gentleman playing, I think it was a violin in the middle of the streets in one area, and you had one group of partisans on one side and one group of partisans on the other side. And was this a factual thing that you had written about?
This connects with what I said a little bit ago, that when I had seen the painting that Chagall did of the man playing his violin on top of the buildings, it's like, I'm going to have a Fiddler on the Roof scene. I've got to have a Fiddler on the Roof scene happen sometime in this book. And then I thought, how can I also have it show the division among the people? And so I thought, perfect, I'll have there's all kinds of weird street intersections in these old, 1,000-year-old villages. So he's going to be up on the roof, and one side of the roof, there's like the pro-communist crowd. And on the other side of the roof, there's a pro-democracy crowd. And he's playing to them both equally so that they're both satisfied. And I have him like doing a lot of dancing up there, because I actually believe anyone who wants to cater to both groups is going to have to do some pretty fancy footwork. And then I remembered from childhood that song that has a call and response song, Alouette. And so he gets the two sides singing, back and forth, doing Alouette with each other, because he's an entertainer and he wants them to put money in the hat. And he thinks he's got them bridged, and then it starts to rain and everyone leaves, including him. This story that works on a couple level. It's definitely influenced by Chagall, as I said. He's not in this scene, but it's influenced by him. And it is what was going on in that time. And it is how it reflects on today's time. And so I'm trying to work at a couple of levels there. The most important thing is it has to be a compelling story. And then if I can put layers in, then all the better. But so that's where that scene came from.
It reminds me so much of the book The Cellist of Sarajevo. I don't know if you ever read that book, where the gentleman goes out every day at noon and plays his cello in the middle of the war-torn city.
Yes, I remember when that was going on and how moving that was. Did he survive that war?
Yes.
Do you know?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Good.
Yeah, that's what they say he did. Yeah, but that was a wonderful book. But it reminded me so much about that, because he's doing the same thing, just playing for everybody on both sides, and he doesn't care. He's going to try to bring a little bit of peace and a little bit of sanity to this whole thing.
It's a similar sort of thing, and there's a statue to this man. When the Scots came ashore on D-Day, the first person off of their boat was a bagpiper. And, those things are loud, and he was unarmed, carrying bagpipes, walking up that beach while there's just slaughter happening all around him. And almost all of the Germans had never heard a bagpipe before, and they were terrified.
Yeah.
And he survived, and the Scots captured that beach, and there is now a big statue of a man in a kilt with bagpipes right next to the beach in Arromanches.
Wow, that's great. You got a lot of interesting side characters in this, all of whom also, I think, are damaged to one way or the other. One gentleman won't speak. Another person is always sarcastic, Tell a little bit about those few characters, please.
Okay, well, the first thing is that I thought it was important in terms of the emotional stakes for the characters in this book that every one of them is damaged by the war. Every single character in this book is damaged by the war. Only one has a physical injury, minor character. He's got a bad leg. Everyone else is damaged emotionally. And I thought about each of them, and there's the one who never speaks, and I didn't know in the beginning why he doesn't speak. But it turns out it's because his voice would give him away, and I don't want to say any more than that. But he has his reason. There's another man who never tells anyone his name. And I decided at the beginning of the book, I was not going to give that to the reader. You do not get to know his name at the end. And it's because his name is associated with an act of great cowardice. We do learn what the act was,
yes,
but we don't get his name. And so on, right down the line that each of them has, in addition to their own background, and they all have different backgrounds, some are really educated, some are not. Some are political or military, some are not. But they each have different skills. And one guy is really good at blowing glass, and another guy is really good at coloring it, and another guy is really good at feeding the kilns, and another guy, everyone has their strengths. And so I felt like that's kind of where we are right now. I don't see any political or cultural unifying force. I see a lot of really divided people, and they each are damaged. All sides are damaged, and all sides have something to offer to the solution. It's a very important moment in the novel when two men find out that they're in love with the same woman and that she's been with them both, and she's completely unapologetic, and they're about to just have the fight of all time. And she says, before you kill each other, keep in mind what you have built together already, and imagine what you could continue to build if you continue to work together. And that leads them, rather than fighting, into what I think is really kind of an uplifting way to go forward with their lives, and where the novel is most hopeful. I want to make that a headline, just look at what you've built, America, and think of what you could build if you worked together. And this book is, it's not a polemic. It's not like, here's the recipe for a better America. It's not that. It's a story about people recovering from World War II. But I think that there are ways it's similar.
Mm-hmm. Yep, very true. I remember at one point they actually went into the town and they saw a couple of buildings that were rebuilt, but that was it. And now Asher's confused. How did these buildings get rebuilt so quickly, and where did they get the money? Where did they come from? How did those first few buildings get rebuilt?
The thing about Reims is it's actually the political center and economic center of the Champagne region. So, of course, when I was in Reims doing my research on the cathedral, I felt it was imperative as a thorough journalist and reporter that I get the full experience there. Some people are willing to suffer for their art. And so there are enough champagne companies that I did suffer a little. But at any rate, they were sort of like if you owned the factory in some towns or you owned the coal mine in West Virginia. They had a kind of economic domination. And so that was what led the rebuilding. Because, what happens is Asher sees these buildings and he starts to get all optimistic. And they're like, nah, it's going to be harder than that. And it's a gentle way of saying, there's no immediate happy ending. Rebuilding a nation takes years and years and years. And there are a couple places that France chose not to rebuild on purpose. And it's not dissimilar to the Germans choosing to maintain the concentration camps, not pave them over, but keep them as historical memory. So, if you go to Normandy, where the D-Day invasion happened, the bomb craters are still there. The German pillboxes are still there. The ships that were sunk in the harbor are rusting right there in the water, that kind of thing. It's still there.
Wow. One thing we learn a lot about in this book is how to make glass.
Yes.
Where did you get all your background in glass blowing and glass making?
I spent a lot of time with two organizations. One is a guy named Larry Rebecki. He is a world-class stained glass window maker. And, if a church in the state of Vermont or beyond needs a new window or a window gets broken or something, he's the guy who does that. And he also makes them for high-end homes and stuff like that. And he's kind of a curmudgeon, and he was very, very helpful. I learned a ton from him. He's really patient, and he gave me books on stained glass and so on. And then the really fun part was I went to this company called A.O. Glass, letter A, letter O, Glass, also in Burlington, Vermont. And these folks make vases and pitchers and wine glasses and cocktail glasses and all that sort of stuff, and Christmas decorations, all that sort of stuff. But they also make high art. And in fact, when I was doing my research there, they were making 10,000 kind of frosted globes for the next sculpture by Maya Lin, the woman who designed the Vietnam Memorial Wall. So they're doing like really high-end art. And I come in there, I'm gray-haired, I'm kind of preppy, I got a notebook, I'm asking all these questions and writing all these things down, to the point where they're like, okay, enough of that. And they take away my notebook and pen, and it's like, buddy, you're blowing glass right now. And what I can tell you about my glass blowing is I'm awful. I'm terrible. Like, they were laughing. They'd never seen anyone worse at it. But at the end of the little project that I was doing with them, there was a little glob left. And one of the guys kind of tapped it on a table and then handed me some kind of tweezers that were very long, so I'd be away from the heat. And he would say, pinch, 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 while he turned this glob. And lo and behold, I'd made a glass flower. And right then was when I got the idea for the glass flower that I put into the novel. And for the people who haven't read the book yet, it is somewhat of a symbol of love. And it's not a huge symbol in the book, but it sort of matters at the end. And in fact, instead of it saying the end at the end of this book, I have a drawing of a glass flower in a vase. And when I've been on tour, I've been giving away one glass flower at every event on tour, which I made there. And part of the fun of it is, look, let's say you make a nice globe, and I couldn't do it. I could not make one. I tried, I could not make one. But let's say you're making one and it starts to droop a little bit off the pipe before you've got it on the cooling pad. Do you catch it? No, right? It's 1700 degrees. And if it falls and shatters on the floor, do you sweep it up? No, it will set your broom on fire. And I think about that kind of hazard as being part of how you do your art. And I think about, like, for me, it's like, oh no, my laptop battery ran out. Oh no, I'm out of printer ink. Like, it's just so tame. And so I actually liked, it's really hot in these places. You sweat a lot and kind of stink when you're doing it. And everyone is so into concentrating on what they're doing, so focused. And it was great, great fun. And so I had my book launch there rather than at a bookstore. That was a great part of, in addition to reading books and looking at lots of stained glass windows, the actual hands-on stuff was a blast.
Before we go, I want to ask you a question about World War II fiction and what your thought is about, is it trending downwards, or are we going to see new fiction sort of like yours? It's not just so much about the Holocaust and Auschwitz, but about other aspects that we don't get every day here in America and learning about World War II. Where do you see a fiction?
Great question, and I think a lot of editors and writers are trying to sort that out right now. I sense that there's some fatigue in people reading World War II stories. A couple times people said, I've stopped reading World War II, but I wanted to read this book of yours because I've liked others. My next book is not a World War II book. It's set in contemporary times. That'll be out in February of 2025. Here's the thing, Hollywood has said for the last 20 years or more, what the public wants is a story about a hero who's going to save everyone, a superhero who's going to save everyone. And we don't have to do much except get out of the way of the falling cars. But the heroes are going to take care of it for us. And I would say that that's what Hollywood has done. It's made them billions of dollars. But I think that in the world of books, there aren't superheroes. It's much more ordinary people who get caught up in something much larger than themselves and how they rise to the occasion. The main character of the Glass Chateau is a guy who builds boots. He makes nice boots. And everyone around him, similar kind of modest lives, and yet they must rise to the challenge of World War II. I think those stories are indelible and they will last and matter, but I think that they're going to need different settings. And we're going to need to look at different periods in time when right and wrong are less kind of easy to see, when there's more gray. I think there's going to be an evolution. I still have another World War II book that I want to write very much. It's a great epic story, but I think that like a 900-page World War II book right now, it's not going to get the same attention as it would have 15 years ago. I think, even though there are people that are writing fresh things and there's been some great books written, I think the readers will want to look in other directions. I have a friend who's just finished up a Civil War book, for example, and very eager to read that. That's Chris Bogellian has that coming.
Oh, does he? I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you haven't had him, he's a great guy, good friend. Very, very, like the most generous friend I've ever had. Such a good guy. And he's got a book coming out in March, and then the next one is going to be the Civil War one. That's what he's working on now. But I think that there's other stories to be told. And what I tried to do with this one was make it post-war. There are no battles in this book. There's memories and there's damage to be recovered from. And I think if there's a great, great story, then people will still turn to it. And I also think I don't want a superhero story. I'm totally bored with a superhero story. I have been for a long time. So we got to find new ways. And by the way, it also means we need to talk about female models of heroism. We've had 5,000 years of literature looking at male models of heroism. It's why I always have really strong female characters. Often they're my narrators, because I think there's a lot still to be examined there.
Right. It drives me nuts when I go and I look for these books, and I'll be honest with you, I get them on NetGalley and other locations, and it'll say women's fiction. A woman's the head of it. It is about her point of view, but it's not a woman's fiction book. And I've talked to a lot of those ladies, and they themselves agree, it's not a woman's fiction book. It's historical fiction. It's a book about our history book, about what women were doing at that time. And you're exactly correct. The more and more we're seeing the women's place in history shining forth.
Yes, and I think when it really matters when you stop seeing books titled The Pilot's Wife,
yes,
Soldier's Daughter, but instead it just becomes, like my next book is titled The Finder. The Finder's a woman. She's my favorite character I ever wrote, and it's just the Finder. It's not the Finder's wife.
Okay, good.
There's room for agency
great.
and growth in that, for sure.
Good. So that's what you're working on. You're just about done with that book, or have you sent that in already to your publisher?
I'm expecting any day to get it back from my editor for the revision that it will definitely need, and I really trust her, so I'm looking forward to her feedback with some nervousness. But again, I'm not in black and white on this. I'm about ordinary folks being in an issue bigger than themselves here and now. I really enjoy writing something that's contemporary. One of the things that's difficult is in my history writing, historical fiction writing, there are things that people don't know and they can't go find out. And there are also times that people need to communicate and they can't reach each other. Or a letter takes 2 weeks to arrive, things like that. And when you write in the present, somebody wants to know something, they take out the encyclopedia in their pocket, right? And if somebody wants to communicate with somebody, they got 9 different ways they can reach them. And that really changes the tempo of things. Because I also think, just as in real life, when somebody picks up their phone and starts engaging with it, if you're next to them and they just became boring, likewise in a book, you can't have somebody take out, open their laptop or start working away on their phone without the story just dying. So accounting for those things is a good challenge of craft and making the story move along.
That's great. Well, it sounds like you had a lot of good stuff coming. I appreciate it. You had great books before. And friends, I'm going to tell you what, this is one fine author, The Glass Chateau. It is a book that will stay with me forever and ever. I love this book. And I read this book around 3 or 4 months ago, and I still remember all. Yeah, I read it well. Yeah. I do my research well in advance.
Well, that's great. But do you remember the first chapter and you remember the dogs? I'm impressed.
Yeah.
It's really great.
Yeah, it's how much it stays with me, Stephen. It's just stayed with me. It's a great book. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on today to Books and Looks. I'm so glad, and I look forward to your next book, and hopefully we can have you back then again.
I'd love it, and thanks for having me on today. Real pleasure.
All right. Very good. Friends, we'll be right back. Again, thanks so much, Stephen, for being with us. We really appreciate you coming on and giving us this wonderful view of healing after World War II and all the difficulties that so many people had after that horrible, horrible war over there in Europe. And, that brings me to what I'm looking at. And what I'm looking at is World War II novels. And if you've noticed this year, we have had a lot of post-World War II novels. We had A Bakery in Paris, we've had Under the Java Moon, and now we've had The Glass Chateau. And each of these books I chose because they are different. They are unique. Now, I don't want to sit there and denigrate the books that have come out or the topics which they have written about, because there's some very interesting novels about that. But the time has come that we are looking for some other type of World War II novels. So what do we have? A lady on a bakery in Paris? That main character helped feed the poor, starving people after World War II. That's a story you don't hear about. We then went Under the Java Moon with Heather Moore. We learned about the Dutch East Indies POW camps and the horrors they went through. You never heard about that. That's never been written about. And now we have The Glass Chateau with Stephen Kiernan. Again, a look at healing, a question about what is peace after victory. How do you rebuild a country so totally devastated? These are all books that are out there, novels about World War II. And I encourage each and every one of you to not just look at these 3 books, and obviously I would love for you to read them all, but what I want to have you do is keep searching for non-traditional books about that war, because they're out there. And there are authors who are writing really fine books about this. I know we got to look a little bit harder because, the book industry wants to keep pushing the same type of book. And you know what? I've read those. I don't need to keep reading them anymore. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at. World War II novels, and the fact that we're dealing with the non-traditional type novel here on Books and Looks, and I think you're really going to enjoy them if you give them a chance. Anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, and for Books and Looks, this is Blaine DeSantis saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.